Chapter 10. The Shrine of St. Finbarr. There are two ways of getting from Cork to Killarney. One by the so-called Prince of Wales route, because the late King Edward went that way in 1858, and the other by way of Macroom. Both routes converge at Glengariff, and are identical beyond that. And as the best scenery along the route is between Glengariff and Killarney, I don't think it really matters much which route is chosen. The Prince of Wales route is by rail to Bantry, and then either by boat or coach to Glengariff, which is only a few miles away. The other route is to Macroom by rail, and from there is a very fine ride by coach of nearly 40 miles to Glengariff. We chose the Macroom route because of the longer coach ride, and because it touches Barre, the famous retreat of St. Finbarr. I think on the whole it is the more picturesque of the two routes, but either is vastly preferable to the all-rail route. Indeed, the visitor to Killarney who misses the run from Glengariff misses some of the most beautiful and impressive scenery in all Ireland. It was shortly after 9 o'clock that our train pulled out of the station at Cork, and at first the line ran between small, well-tilled fields, each with its cosy cottage. The whole countryside had an air of content and passable well-being. Every wall was gay with the yellow gorse, and in the fields the green of potato and turnip was just beginning to show above the dark earth of the ridges in which they were planted. These ridged fields, which we were to see so often afterwards in the west of Ireland, tell of a ground so soaked with moisture that it must be carefully and thoroughly drained before anything will grow in it. The ridges, which run with the slope of the land, are usually about 18 inches wide and are separated by ditches a foot wide and a foot deep to carry off the excess moisture. There is always a trickle of water at the bottom of these ditches, and the task of keeping them open and free from weeds is a never-ending one. Presently, on a high rock away to the left, appeared the tower which is all that is left of the old stronghold of the Barretts, and farther on are the green-clad ruins of Kilcrea Abbey, and nearby is another great keep marking an old castle of the McCarthys. And then the train skirts the wild bog of Kilcrea, and then there are more ruins, and still more, and at last the train stops at its terminus, Macroom. The motor coach was awaiting us, and we were relieved to find that, so far from being crowded, there was only one other couple, Americans like ourselves, to make the trip. The season had opened only the day before, and after we got started, the driver confided to us that this was the first time he had ever been over the road. Even if he hadn't told us, we should soon have had every reason to suspect it. The road follows the valley of the Lee, which is not here the single clear and shining stream which we saw above Cork, but is broken into a score of channels between islands covered with low-growing brush, a sort of morass of a strange and weird appearance. Here and there an ivied ruin towers above the trees, for this was the country of the O'Learys, and these are the strongholds they built to defend it against the aggressions of their neighbours. And then we rattled down the street of a little village, and the driver brought the coach to a stop before the door of an inn, told us that this was Inchigeela, and that there would be 10 minutes for refreshments, and then disappeared in the direction of the bar. I suppose he got his refreshments for nothing, as a reward for stopping there. At least I can think of no other reason for stopping, since Inchigeela is only half an hour from Macroom, unless it was to give the nerves of the passengers a chance to quiet down a little. For we had already begun to realise that our driver was a speed maniac. He had struck a hair-raising gait from the start, had sent the lumbering bus down grades and around turns at a rate that was decidedly disconcerting. And while there had been no special danger except to the people we met, for the road was bordered by high earthen walls, the rattle and jar of the solid tyres had been enough to make the teeth chatter. So we were glad when the racket stopped, and we could get down and stroll about a little. And we soon found that Inchigeela is a very quaint village. We walked down to the bridge over the Lee, and looked at Loch Alloa stretching away to the west. And then we stopped at a tumble-down cottage to talk to an old woman who was leaning over her half-door, and she invited us in and asked us to sit down. It was my first glimpse of the interior of an Irish cottage of the poorer class, and it opened my eyes to the cruel lot of the people, and there are many, many thousands of them who are compelled to live in such surroundings. There was just one room, perhaps 8 feet by 15, lighted by 2 little windows about 18 inches square, one on either side of the door. The doorway was just high enough to enter without stooping, and ran from the ground right up to the eaves, The floor was of clay, and the walls inside had been daubed with mud to fill up the cracks, and then whitewashed, but the damp had flaked the whitewash off in great leprous-looking blotches. The ceiling was formed by some rough boards laid on top of the joists overhead, so low that one feared to stand upright, and I suppose the dark space under the thatch was used as a sleeping room, for there was a ladder leading to it, and I saw nothing in the room below which looked like a bed. There may have been a bed there, however, which, being new to rural Ireland, I did not recognise as such. At one end of the room was an open fireplace in which a few blocks of turf smoked and flared, with that pungent odour which we had already come to like, but which, at such close quarters, was a little overpowering. A black and battered pot hung on a crane above the fire, and some sort of mess was bubbling in it. Potatoes, I suppose. There was a rude table and 2 or 3 chairs, and all sorts of rags and debris hung against the walls and piled in the corners, and a few dishes in a rough homemade dresser, and an old brush broom, and some boxes and a lot of other indescribable trash. 3 or 4 bedraggled chickens were wandering in and out, and I glanced around for the pig. But there was no pig. This family was far too poor to own one. It seemed impossible that a human being could live for any length of time in a place so bare of comfort, and I looked at the old woman, who had sat down across from us, and wondered how she managed to survive. I suspect she was not half so old as her wrinkled face and sunken eyes and shrivelled hands indicated. She lived there with her husband, she said, and had for many years. He was a labourer, and in good times could earn 10 shillings a week. But most of the time it was impossible to find any work at all. She had no relatives in America to turn to, and neither she nor her husband was old enough to get a pension, so that it was a hard struggle to keep out of the workhouse. But they had kept out thus far, glory be to God, though the struggle was growing harder every year, for they were getting older and their rheumatism was getting worse, and neither of them could work as they once could. All this was said quite simply, in a manner not complaining, but resigned, as if accepting the inevitable. Her philosophy of life seemed to be that, since fate had chosen to set herself and her husband in the midst of circumstances so hard, there was nothing to do but struggle on as long as possible, with the certainty of coming to the workhouse in the end. No doubt they would be far more comfortable in the workhouse than they'd ever been outside of it, and yet they had that horror of it which is common to all Irish men and women. The horror, I think, is not so much the abstract idea of receiving charity, as at the public stigma which the workhouse gives. The Irish have been eager enough to draw their old age pensions, and many of them, who shrink from the workhouse as from a foul disgrace, do not hesitate to beg a few pennies from the passing stranger. The old woman at Inchigeela, however, did not beg, nor intimate in any way that she desired or expected money, but she did not refuse the coin I slipped into her hand, after I had taken the picture of her and of her cottage, which you will find opposite this page. Perhaps she would have liked to do so, but the little coin represented a measure of potatoes or of turnips, and so a little less hunger, a little more strength. How many of us, I wonder, would be too proud to beg if we could find no work to do, and our backs were bare, and our stomachs empty? The tooting of the horn warned us that our bus was ready to go on again, and we were soon skirting the shore of Loch Alloa, with picturesque mountains closing in ahead. And then our driver crossed the bridge over the Lee, and made a wrong turning, and didn't know it until somebody shouted at him, and set him right. And this small misadventure seemed completely to wreck his self-control, so that, when he got back to the main road, he rushed along in a manner more terrifying than ever. The fearful racket heralded our approach, else there must have been more than one bad accident. And I can yet see wild-eyed men leaping from their seats and springing frantically to their horses' heads, while the white-faced women seated in the carts peered out at us under their shawls as we brushed past, and no doubt sent a malediction after us. Geese, chickens and pigs scurried wildly in every direction, and that we did not leave the road strewn with their dead bodies was little less than a miracle. The road ran between high hedges, so that we could see only a little way ahead, and we got to watching the curves with a sort of fascination, for it seemed certain that we must run into something at the next one. We had been mounting gradually all this time, often up gradients so steep that they kept the driver busy with his gears, and the view had gradually widened and grown in impressiveness. Then we turned off a narrow road at the right, and I thought for a moment our driver had gone wrong again. "We're going to Barre," he explained, seeing my look, for I sat in the seat beside him, and in a few minutes we were skirting a narrow loch, hemmed in on the north by a range of precipitous mountains, with gullied sides patched with grey granite, and dark heather, as bare and desolate as a mountain could be. There is an inn by the lake shore, and the bus stopped in front of it. The driver showed us with a gesture the little island containing the shrine of St. Finbar, and then hastened away into the inn. We four started for the island, and presently we heard heavy steps behind us, and an animated scarecrow armed with a big stick came running up and shouted something in an incomprehensible tongue, and waved the stick above his head, and proceeded to lead the way. He was evidently the guide, so we followed him along the border of the lake, and across the narrow strip of land which now connects the island with the shore. And all the time our guide was talking in the most earnest way, but not a word could any of us understand. It sounded remotely like English, and he evidently understood English, for when we asked him to repeat some particularly emphatic bit, he would do so with added emphasis, but quite in vain. I shall never forget how earnestly he would look in our faces, raising his voice as though we were deaf, and pointing with his stick, and gesturing with his other hand, in the effort to make us understand. We persuaded him to go and sit down after a while, and then we had a chance really to look about us. There is something indescribably savage and threatening about that dark sheet of water, shadowed by gloomy cliffs, bare of vegetation, and torn into deep gullies by the cataracts which leap down them. Through the hills to the east, the water from the lake has carved itself a narrow outlet, and the stream which rushes away through this gorge is the beginning of the River Lee. No place so grand and desolate would be without its legend, and this is Barre's. When the blessed St. Patrick gathered together all the snakes in Ireland, and drove them over the mountains and into the western sea, there was one hideous monster which he overlooked, so well had it concealed itself in this mountain-circled tarn. It was a winged dragon, and it kept very quiet until the saint was dead, for fear of what might happen. But, once Patrick was gathered to his fathers, the dragon fancied it might do as it pleased. So it issued forth, all the more savage for its years of retirement, and started to lay waste the country. The frightened people appealed to their saints to help them, and among those who put up prayers was a holy man named Barre, who had a hermitage on an island in the lake, and so knew the dragon well. And the saints in heaven looked down and saw the distress of the poor people and pitied them, and they told Barre that they would give him power to slay the dragon on one condition, and that condition was that he should build a church on the spot where the waters of the lake met the tide of the sea. Finian accepted the condition gladly, and went out and met the monster, and slew it, and threw its body into the lake, and its black blood darkens the water to this day. And when that was done, he set off down the river, and, at the spot where its waters met the tide, he built his church, and the city of Cork grew up about it. And then, in place of the church, he built a great cathedral, and when he died his body was placed in a silver coffin and buried before its high altar. Then the city was plundered by the Danes, who dug up the coffin and carried it away, and what became of the saint's bones, no one knows. But the little island where he first lived has been a holy place from that day to this, and on the anniversary of his death, which comes in September, crowds of pilgrims journey here to say their prayers before the 13 stations set apart by tradition, and to bless themselves with water from the saint's well. The well is just at the entrance to the island, and its water is supposed to possess miraculous power. Our voluble but ununderstandable guide invited us by urgent gestures to test its efficacy, but the water looked scummy and dirty, and we declined. A few steps farther on is a small stone-roofed chapel, built in the likeness of Cormac's Chapel on the Rock of Cashel, and in it services are held during the days of pilgrimage to the shrine. There are also some remains of an old chapel, supposed to have been St. Finbar's own. But by far the most interesting thing on the island is the stone enclosure within which the pilgrims say their prayers. The enclosure, which is surrounded by a heavy wall of stones laid loosely on each other, after the ancient Irish fashion, is about 30 feet square, and its level is some feet below that of the ground outside, so that one goes down into it by a short flight of steps. In the centre of the enclosure, a plain wooden cross stands on a platform of 5 steps. On the flagstone at its foot is an inscription telling in detail how the rounds are to be performed on the vigil and forenoon of St. Finbarr's feast day. In the enclosing wall, which is 14 feet thick in places, under heavy arches are 8 cells, which may be used as places of retreat by those undergoing penance. The Stations of the Cross are set in the upper portion of the wall, but are ugly modern plaster casts. I took a picture of the place, which will be found opposite, and which gives a fairly good idea of it. In the middle of a scrubby grove, a little way from the enclosure, is a wishing stone, which had evidently been much used, I hope to good purpose, for the stone itself was covered with trinkets, and the bushes round about were hung thickly with rags and hairpins and rosaries and other tokens. I picked up somewhere, perhaps from the jargon of the guide, that this wishing stone is the altar of Finbarr's old chapel, but I haven't been able to verify this, and it may not be so. But the game is to put up a prayer to the saint, and make your wish, and leave some token to show you are in earnest, and the wish will surely come true. Of course, we made a wish, and added some halfpennies to the collection on the altar. In turning over the trinkets already deposited there, we were amused to find 2 bright Lincoln cents. On the shore just opposite the island is a little cemetery held in great repute because of the holy men who are buried there. For the island has been the home of a succession of hermits from the time St. Finbarr left it to build his church at Cork, and there are many legends of their saintly lives and wonderful deeds. When they died, they were buried in the cemetery, where there is also a cross to the memory of Jeremiah Callanan, a poet native to the neighbourhood, who celebrated the shrine in some pretty verses beginning: "There is a green island in lone Gugon Barre, where Alloa of songs rushes forth as an arrow. In deep valleyed Desmond, 1,000 wild fountains come down to that lake from their home in the mountains." But the wild honking of the horn told us it was time to go. Our guide realised this too, and was back at our heels more voluble and inarticulate than ever. Not too inarticulate, however, to sell the nobby shillelagh to our companions, and to accept with thanks the pennies I dropped into his hand. He tried to stay, hat in hand, until we departed, but the strain was too much for him, and after a moment he made off for the bar of the inn. Our chauffeur was evidently vexed that we had lingered so long at the shrine of the saint, for he hurtled us down the rough by-road at a great rate, whirled into the smoother highway on 2 wheels, and then opened his throttle wide and pushed up his spark and let her rip. The road mounted steadily, with the view to the south opening more and more, and a rugged range of hills ahead coming closer and closer until they lay flung right across the road, and then we swept around a sharp turn and entered the pass of Kimani. The guidebooks assert that no pass in Europe exceeds it in grandeur, but this is a gross exaggeration. It is not nearly so fine, for instance, as the pass of Clamberis, and yet it is wild and savage and very beautiful. A deep gorge cut right through the mountains by a glacier, which has left the marks of its passage on the rocks on either side. There is just room between the craggy precipices for a narrow road and the rugged channel of the rushing stream which drains the mountains. The pass is most picturesque near its eastern end, for there the cliffs are steepest, and the overhanging crags assume their most fantastic shapes. In every nook and cranny of the rocks, ferns and heather and wild flowers have found a foothold, the feathery plumes of London pride being especially noticeable. Here in Ireland it is called St. Patrick's cabbage, and no doubt there is a legend connecting the saint with it, but I have never happened to run across it. As we plunged deeper into the pass, the walls on either side closed in more and more. Great boulders dislodged from the heights above crowded the road so closely that more than once it was forced to turn aside to avoid them. The greenery of fern and colour of flower gave place to the sober hue of the heather and the dark green of the bog myrtle. And then we were suddenly conscious that the stream by the roadside, which had been flowing back toward Cork, was flowing forward toward Bantry Bay, and we knew that we had reached the summit of the watershed, dividing east from west. And then the hills fell back, and there, far below us, stretched a great rugged valley, with a tiny river wandering through and white threads of roads curving here and there, and Lilliputian houses scattered among the fields. The car paused for an instant on the edge of this abyss, and then plunged into it. At least, that was the sensation it gave its passengers. I do not know that I have ever travelled a steeper road, or one which wound more threateningly near the unguarded edges of precipices. Certainly not in a heavy motor bus, hurtling along at 30 miles an hour. Perhaps the brakes were not holding, or perhaps the driver had had a drink too much. At any rate, we bounced from rock to rock, and spun around sharp turns only a foot or two from the edge of the road, which there was absolutely nothing to guard, and which dropped sheer for hundreds of feet. But, at last, the more hair-raising of these turns were left behind. The road straightened out along the side of the hill, and then, far ahead, we saw opening out below us the blue waters and craggy shores of Bantry Bay. Down and down we dropped, with new vistas opening every minute, until we were running close beside the border of the bay, and for 10 miles we followed its convolutions. Then we swung away between high hedges, and Betty nearly fell out of the bus, for the hedges were of fuchsias, 10 feet high, and heavy with scarlet flowers. That was the crowning delight of that wonderful drive. We ran between high rows of fuchsias for perhaps half a mile, and a moment later we were climbing out in front of the hotel at Glengariff, half an hour ahead of scheduled time.